from critics. I'm not sure I'd say it's an outright bad game, but I wasn't blown away by it either, and I wanted to take some time.
That accent is fucking pornography. Right? That accent is fucking pornography.
To address the undeserved
For a
critical
critique,
reception it's received
it's
by
so
highlighting
good.
many of its problems. This video will contain spoilers for the entire plot of BioShock Infinite.
Just to say, if you've never seen MatthewMatosis, like, well worth it. Like, I love this guy. He doesn't do many videos. He does very, very few. But I would highly recommend the Metal Gear Solid series he did. Let me just check here before I come back to it. I haven't watched his Death Stranding one yet because I haven't played it yet. And I can't watch his videos until I've played it. They're very, very good. The Metal Gear Solid review, it's like 5 hours
Hello,
long.
ladies and gentlemen. This is the first in a series of...
You can see, like, they're like 35 minutes, 42 minutes, 42 minutes, an hour and 20 for Metal Gear Solid 4. Peace Walker and all that. But they're so good. They're so... Oh, you can't see. I'm an idiot. But yeah, if you go here, like, the Metal Gear Solid review series is really good. It's like 4 or 5 hours. The Mario one's actually surprisingly good. The Zelda one is spectacular.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
It's the older ones. You can see the mic's not as good, but I mean, they're so good. Oh, he's done Breath of the Wild. No shit. I haven't seen the Breath of the Wild one. But yeah, well worth it. He's kind of more known for Dark Souls stuff, but I think this stuff is better. And he's done these one-offs as well.
Recently, I played BioShock Infinite, and I couldn't help but be taken aback. It's sometimes downright impressive. But at the end of the day, anyone who's played a modern first-person shooter has already seen plenty of stuff like this. They're first-person cutscenes with varying degrees of player input. They might be pretty to look at, but they're ultimately nothing more than a roller coaster ride, a cheap thrill. The effect of these has long since worn off on me, and I imagine many others feel the same way.
I did at the time.
So if the gameplay is schizophrenic and underdeveloped, then BioShock Infinite needs to fall back hard on its story to be a worthwhile experience. Right away, one major element stripped out compared to the original BioShock is the morality system.
Yeah.
This definitely needed some work, because the repetitive nature of harvesting little sisters turned them into just another gameplay element rather than the moral choice it was supposed to be. Once you made that decision for the first little sister, you were likely to stick to that choice for the rest of the game.
That is true. Like, I mean, I never thought about it that way, but he's absolutely right. Like, once you decided, because I think because we usually replay the BioShocks every year-ish. We haven't played it this year, but usually we replay them every year. We do just kind of decide at the start, do we save or kill the sisters? That's usually what we do. But once we do make that choice at the start, that's what we stick with, right? There's no decision whatsoever to mess around with them. Yeah, it's true. It's a decision you just make once.
Flawed though the morality was in BioShock 1, at least there were different endings depending on what the player chose, another thing which Infinite lacks. The lack of multiple endings wouldn't be harmful if not for the fact that the ending is terrible anyway.
It begins, except for the fact that the ending is terrible anyway.
It has to be one of the dumbest explanations of the many worlds theory I've ever seen. I know the rebuttal to this is going to be that I didn't enjoy it because I don't understand it. So I'm going to take a minute to break down the plot in great detail. This is the timeline of events.
This is so good. Oh, this is like wiping your ass with silk. I love this. This is like, fuck you. It's bad. It's really bad.
Before the game starts, Booker takes place in the Wounded Knee Massacre and ends up slaughtering Native Americans. Later on, he's overcome with guilt, which tempts him to baptize himself and be reborn. In one timeline, Booker goes through with the baptism and becomes born again as Zachary Comstock. In the other timeline, Booker changes his mind and refuses the baptism. He remains known as Booker DeWitt. Comstock, washed of his guilt, goes on to meet the female version of Nupss, and she develops the technology to...
I never got this on my first playthrough, that the Nupsses were the same person, but gender swapped. I thought they were brother and sister or something. It never occurred to me when I did my first playthrough of Infinite that the Nupsses are the same person. It never dawned on me at any point. I thought they were like a brother and sister scientist combo or something like that. And it should have fucking dawned on me so quickly that they're actually just the same person.
Travel between...
Yeah, they're the same person. It never dawned on me. But when we replayed Infinite last year, it then makes sense. Because there's news stories and stuff about like the female Nupss and the male Nupss in their different worlds when they work together to create the parallels.
Timelines. In the process of experimenting with the tears, Comstock becomes sterile. During this time, he also becomes the leader of Columbia. Booker remains guilt-ridden, but finds himself a wife and has a child with her, Anna, who will later be known as Elizabeth. Booker's wife dies during childbirth, and around this time he also accrues a massive gambling debt. His life is in shambles.
Gamba, dude. Gamba.
Comstock, who wants an heir for himself, decides to offer his alternate version a deal. Give up the girl, and they'll wipe away his gambling debt, allowing him to start fresh. Booker agrees, but has second thoughts not long after. Despite this, they manage to take Elizabeth away from him to Comstock's timeline. Some years pass for Booker before the Luteces intervene and bring him to Comstock's timeline in order to get Elizabeth back. This seems to be because the male Lutece feels guilt about what they did, and also because their relationship with Comstock hasn't been good since he tried to kill them. It may also be some sort of experiment to them. Their goals are never made entirely clear.
God, I wish we had a Lutece DLC. Any agreeers? Like, for BioShock fans, right? For BioShock fans, don't you wish we had a Lutece DLC? I would have fucking loved a Lutece DLC. Like, some story about the Luteces. They were a big mystery. It was kind of fun.
This is the point where the game begins. We should also note that Booker's original timeline is no longer important. There are now essentially two Bookers in the other timeline instead. Booker travels along through Comstock's Columbia in search of Elizabeth, and for the first part of the game, time is working linearly as you would expect. This changes when Booker and Elizabeth decide they need guns for the Vox Populi. They eventually discover they exist in a universe where the gunsmith is dead, so they hop across realities to one where he's alive. Unfortunately, in this new universe, his tools have been confiscated, so they go on the look for those, and in the process end up hopping universes again. This time to a reality where Chen Lin is once again dead, but they no longer need him since a rebellion is already happening. Another Booker had already come to this timeline and assisted the Vox before being killed, turning him into a martyr. That Booker is dead, but the player's version of Booker is alive, which causes some confusion and makes the Vox turn against him as well. Time continues linearly again now until Booker and Elizabeth are separated later on. Booker is pulled into the future by an older version of Liz who exists in a timeline where Booker failed to save her. She's become bitter, but she wants to try and make things right, so she gives Booker the knowledge he needs to save her and sends him back into the past. The way the timelines work here is a bit fuzzy, because the old version of Liz may have in fact caused her own timeline to be created by pulling Booker into the future. By doing so, she may have ensured he couldn't rescue her and caused the time paradox. This isn't very important though, and since it's not clear, I'll let it slide. Booker uses the knowledge he was given to avoid the timeline where Liz becomes the leader of Columbia, and this is the final bit of time shenanigans before the ending happens. During the ending sequence, Elizabeth and Booker jump to Rapture, and eventually Elizabeth reveals to Booker the concept of infinite realities, each represented by a lighthouse. He sees other versions of themselves wandering around, and Elizabeth explains that all realities are somewhat different, but somewhat similar. This culminates in the baptism scene where Booker learns he was Comstock, and many variations of Elizabeth show up to drown Booker in order to stop Comstock from existing. After they do so, they vanish, presumably because they're being erased from existence since Booker was her father. In a post-credit scene, we're led to believe that at least one version of Booker survives, and it's up to the player to imagine whether Elizabeth still exists as well. That's the entire plot of BioShock Infinite. I understood it, and I didn't like it. The biggest flaw is the decision to drown Booker at the end in order to stop Comstock from existing. Infinite realities means just that. Infinite realities. Elizabeth even says this herself.
What are we doing here? Comstock's dead. We can just go on with our lives. You don't need
Dead?
to...
You mean like Chen Lin? Like Lady Comstock? No. He is alive in a million worlds.
This means there is some combination of events that leads Booker to become Comstock even without that particular baptism that day. He could go back to town and then change his mind again. He could become the exact same person Comstock was without changing his name. There are any number of ways this could have gone down. In fact, there could be a reality where the outcome of the baptism choice is reversed. The precedent is set for this in the story. There are more than just two realities in Infinite, there are many. And Booker's baptism decision is not the only one which causes new realities to be born. Keeping this in mind, the decision to drown Booker at the end makes no sense because there will always be a reality where things turn out different. In the ending sequence, Elizabeth tries to hastily explain this away by saying some things are always constant. This is, no exaggeration, the worst cop-out I've ever seen. You couldn't formulate a more
No exaggeration. The worst cop-out I've ever seen. I felt it at the time. Like, it so annoyed me when they're killing Booker at the end. And I'm like, why? This doesn't solve anything. Like, the very fact that you guys are here means this doesn't work. Like, what are you doing?
Counterintuitive, nonsensical cop-out if you tried. It runs totally in opposition to the idea of parallel worlds. This is the timeline that BioShock Infinite seems to think it has, but the truth is actually different. We'll need to revise it because it can be proven that realities were branching well before the baptism. The Luteces are born as different genders in each universe, an event which far precedes the baptism. Booker's date of birth is 1874. The quote from the paper at the start is from 1889, and the Wounded Knee massacre took place in 1890, confirming that the Luteces were born well before the baptism date and likely even before Booker, unless the paper was published when they were 15 years old. This has even worse implications for the timeline because it forks the events even earlier up the chain. The earliest known branching point is actually the conception of Lutece, which ends up being one gender or another. It seems likely that Robert is from Booker's timeline and Rosalind is from Comstock's timeline. Assuming this is the case, then the timeline looks like this.
There you go. It's not even the timeline they think they have. That's what I liked about it. It's like, this is the timeline that the game thinks it has. It doesn't. It actually has a different timeline completely. And then it goes up in a totally different direction when you think about it. That's the problem with timey-wimey shenanigans, man. If you can't explain it properly, it just gets so fucked.
In other words, drowning the player character's Booker would potentially cut off all other futures for him on that branch, but would have absolutely no effect on the other branch. You would need to travel earlier up the timeline in order to affect that path. To put it another way, the only way to stop both of those branches from existing would be to go back in time and kill one of the Lutece's parents before they were conceived. This confirms that the drowning at the end fixes nothing. Even if we're kind though and assume that somehow drowning Booker will fix all the timelines shown in the game and ensure that Comstock never exists, it's still a flawed concept. If we buy into this scene, then the game becomes a giant grandfather paradox. For those not familiar with this concept, it's easy to grasp if you apply it to yourself. Suppose you were given the ability to go back in time and for some mad reason you decide while you're in the past you're going to kill your own grandfather. What happens? Well, the answer is nobody knows because it doesn't make any sense. If you kill your grandfather, then you'll never be born, and thus you can't go back in time to kill your grandfather since you don't exist. The many worlds concept does provide a way to do this. If you travel to another timeline and kill your father in an alternate reality, that seems to work out.
He's the driest guy ever, and it's perfect. Like I'm so envious of this style of critique. I really am, because I cannot be this dry, and I cannot like besmirch somebody so heavily, so quickly. Like, I can't.
Fine. But Infinite wants us to believe that all Bookers that could become Comstock or Father Elizabeth will die at this point. It's nothing more than a massive contradiction. If Elizabeth drowns Booker before the baptism, then she can't be born to go back in time and drown her own father. Call me picky, but if a story is going to introduce multiple realities and time travel, I at least expect it to have some idea how these concepts can work. BioShock Infinite uses quantum mechanics as a shorthand for magic, pulling some absolutely moronic scenes like this one.
Are you going to open it?
It's no good. Damn it. I thought once we were here, I could fully control it. I thought...
What is that?
It's a key.
Where did it come from?
It's always been there. I just couldn't see it.
Okay.
At this point, all semblance of plot has been totally lost. It's almost as though the game is admitting it's all being made up as it goes along. The worst thing is, this scene was completely unnecessary, and moments where Elizabeth talks about how she might be creating universes rather than...
There's a hard point, like, for game developers and for movie makers and storytellers, where it's like, it's really cool. And that's it. That's kind of it. Yeah, but it's really cool. It's gonna look sick. We're gonna have like thousands of lighthouses representing all these different worlds. It's gonna look good, but does it make any sense? And no, it doesn't make sense. How do we make that happen? I don't know. How does she open the doors? We'll have a key magically appear somewhere. But it's gonna be sick. And I remember when Infinite came out, and people were telling me about this scene specifically after I played it, because I didn't enjoy Infinite. And they were like, dude, when you're fucking walking through all the realities and shit at the end, it's so cool. And I'm like, yeah, but it's so fucking stupid. It's painfully stupid.
And traveling to them accomplished nothing either.
But we went to Rapture!
It's a point which is repeated several times. The idea of constants and variables seems like it might be some light poke at the structure of games in general. After all, games are built on constants and variables. Everyone playing BioShock Infinite will have a somewhat similar, but somewhat different experience. This allusion to the fact that the player is playing a game is the last bastion of hope for anyone trying to defend the plot of BioShock
There's
Infinite.
a question if some parts need to make sense. I think, yeah, I this is why I agree with Matthew on this one, is if you're pushing the idea of infinite worlds, constants and variables, yes, you do need to explain it, because that is the backbone of the tale you're telling. There are definitely things you don't need to explain. We don't need to know where, like, for example, a cataclysmic event, something fell from the stars and caused some sort of cataclysmic event at some point in your story, right? That's the base of your story, is some event happened. We don't need to know really where that came from. We just need to know that it happened, right? That's where you can be like very loose with having to explain it. As people are like, well, where did this come from? Maybe that's something we'll explore in game number 2 or the sequel or something like that. But for the purposes of our story, we can just have something happened and it was weird. And we can work forward from that point. But in Infinite, I think that what drove a lot of sci-fi nerds like myself crazy is they were really pushing the narrative of constants, variables, the multiple timelines, the fact that there are so many. How many Elizabeths do you bump into in Infinite? 20? Right? There are the main ones like Future Elizabeth and things like that. But, you know, these are the big backbones of this story. And they needed to explain what was going on. And they couldn't. They simply couldn't. They just wanted a lot of cool scenes. I mean, shit, there's fucking... I could forgive Paranormal Activity. They tried to wish away the ghost scene because you fight her mother's ghost, right? You literally fight a ghost in that game. And they were like, it's the emotion ringing through and pulling together from the different timelines or something like that. It was something weird, right? How they justified that you fight a ghost. It was really odd. It was like the emotional pain she went through reached across realities and came together. It was something along those lines.
The end, it accomplishes nothing. It says absolutely nothing about the nature of computer games, which isn't plainly obvious to anyone who's played one.
This is beautiful. I fully recommend this video, but there is one thing I